Before Brad Pitt became one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood, there was a much quieter life. There were no red carpets, no movie premieres, no photographers waiting outside, no one asking for his autograph, and no reason for anyone to believe that the young boy growing up in Missouri would one day become one of the biggest movie stars in the world. Back then, he was simply William Bradley Pitt, a son, a brother, and a young man being raised in an ordinary American family. His father was William Alvin Pitt. Most people knew him simply as Bill. Bill Pitt was not an actor. He was not a director. He was not a producer. He had no Hollywood career of his own. He worked his way up in the trucking business and spent much of his life building a stable life for his family in Missouri. Brad grew up as the oldest of 3 children, with his brother Doug and sister Julie. His mother, Jane, and his father raised their children in Springfield, far away from the world of celebrity that would eventually surround their oldest son. From the outside, there was nothing extraordinary about the family. And perhaps that is exactly why this story matters. Because when people look at Brad Pitt today, it is easy to imagine that his extraordinary life must have begun with an extraordinary childhood. It did not. It began with a family. A father who went to work. A mother who helped raise 3 children. A home in Missouri. And a set of values that were formed long before Hollywood ever knew Brad's name. Brad has spoken about his father many times over the years. And when he talks about Bill, he does not describe a man who taught him how to become famous. He describes a man who taught him how to become capable, how to work, how to take responsibility, how to stand on his own. Bill had grown up in hardship. Brad later described his father as someone who was determined to give his children a better life than the one he had experienced. That determination became part of the way Brad understood his father, and perhaps part of the way he eventually understood himself. There was also something very simple about Bill's approach to fatherhood. He worked hard, but he made time for his children. Brad remembered his father working most of the week and then spending the weekend with his family. They would go fishing. It was not glamorous. It was not something the public would ever see. But decades later, Brad would remember those moments with a different kind of appreciation, especially after becoming a father himself. That is the part of Bill Pitt's story that Hollywood never captured. The ordinary moments, the working days, the weekends, the family trips, the lessons that were never written down. Because before Brad Pitt became a celebrity, he had already learned what it meant to be someone's son. And before Hollywood taught Brad how to live with fame, his father was teaching him how to live without it. So who was the man behind the childhood of Brad Pitt? And how much of the man the world knows today was already being shaped by the father nobody was watching? This is the story of Bill Pitt, the father who raised Brad Pitt before Hollywood. Long before Brad Pitt knew anything about Hollywood, his world was much smaller. It was Missouri. It was school. It was sports. It was family. And it was the everyday rhythm of a home built by parents who wanted their children to have opportunities. William Alvin Pitt and Jane Etta Hillhouse met while attending Oklahoma Baptist University and married in 1962. Their first child, William Bradley Pitt, was born in 1963. Doug followed a few years later. Then Julie. Brad was the oldest, and being the oldest child meant growing up in a family where expectations mattered. His parents were not celebrities. They were not wealthy Hollywood insiders. They lived a comparatively private life. William worked in the trucking business. Jane worked as a school counselor. Together, they raised their children in Springfield, Missouri. That environment became the foundation of Brad's childhood. It was a world where a person's value was not measured by how many people recognized their face. It was measured by whether they showed up. whether they worked, whether they could be depended on, whether they took responsibility for what they were supposed to do. Brad would later describe his father as a practical man, a man who believed in doing things yourself. If something needed fixing, you learned how to fix it. If there was work to be done, you did the work. And if life became difficult, you did not simply wait for somebody else to solve the problem. These ideas may sound ordinary, but they were important to Bill. And Brad remembered them. In later interviews, Brad connected his father's worldview to his own upbringing. He described growing up with an emphasis on being capable and strong. It was not about celebrity. It was not about winning awards. It was about being prepared for life. And there was a reason Bill thought this way. Brad said his father had grown up in extreme hardship and poverty. Bill wanted his children to have more than he had. He wanted them to have opportunities. He wanted them to be able to stand on their own. And according to Brad, he succeeded in that goal. But Bill's story was not simply about working harder and earning more. At some point, he realized that there was another kind of cost. Time. Brad remembered that his father worked most of the week. 5.5 days. Sometimes 6. And yet, when the weekend arrived, Bill took his children fishing. Brad later said that, as a parent himself, he had developed an immense appreciation for what that must have required. Because when you become a parent, you understand something that children usually cannot. Time does not simply appear. You have to make room for it. You have to carve it out of a busy life. And sometimes that means giving something else up. That lesson would become even more meaningful later. Because Bill eventually made a conscious decision to change his position within the company, so he could spend more time with his children. It was not about chasing a bigger title. It was a lateral move. The goal was simple: more time with his family. Brad remembered that decision years later and suggested that perhaps some of that thinking stayed with him. The idea that work matters, but family matters too. And sometimes, you have to make a deliberate choice about what you are willing to sacrifice. There is something almost poetic about that when we look at Brad's later life. Because Brad would eventually enter an industry where time became one of the most valuable things he had. Movies require long hours. Travel, press tours, production schedules, and eventually fatherhood of his own. But before any of that, he had watched his own father make a decision about work and family. He had seen a man work hard, and then he had seen that same man decide that the work could not consume everything. That was the world Bill built. Not a glamorous world, not a famous world, but a world with structure, a world with expectations, a world where family was supposed to matter. And in that world, Brad Pitt grew up. At the time, there was no reason to believe that his life would become extraordinary. He was simply a boy in Missouri. But eventually, that boy would begin to wonder whether the life waiting for him there was enough. And when that question arrived, one of his father's simplest lessons would suddenly become very important. Because sometimes the most important thing a parent can teach a child is not how to stay. It is how to recognize when it is time to go. Hollywood would eventually teach Brad Pitt many things. How to handle fame. How to deal with cameras. How to prepare for a role. How to work with directors. How to survive the strange pressure of being recognized almost everywhere he went. But some of the lessons that mattered most came much earlier. They came from home. And one of the clearest examples happened on a tennis court. Brad played tennis in high school. During one tournament, he became frustrated. Very frustrated. He later remembered being at his all-time McEnroe best. Throwing his racket. Losing his temper. Letting the pressure of competition take over. Then he noticed his father. Bill stood up. He walked down toward the court. And instead of giving his son a long lecture, he asked him one simple question. Are you having fun? Brad said no. Bill answered, then don't do it. And he walked back to his seat. That was it. No dramatic speech. No punishment. No complicated explanation. Just a question. And somehow the pressure disappeared. Years later, Brad said that moment became a major guideline for him. Find something you love to do. If you do not love it, why are you doing it? That idea would follow him far beyond tennis. Because eventually, Brad would have to make a much bigger decision. He would have to decide what kind of life he wanted. The safe answer would have been to finish college. Get the degree. Find a job. Start building a predictable future. But Brad had begun to feel that something else was waiting for him. And perhaps Bill's tennis lesson had prepared him for that moment without either of them knowing it. The lesson was not simply do whatever makes you happy. It was more complicated. It was about recognizing whether the pressure you were experiencing was worth enduring for something you genuinely cared about. That distinction would matter. Because acting is not easy. And Hollywood is certainly not easy. If Brad wanted to become an actor, he would have to accept rejection, uncertainty, financial instability, long periods when nothing seemed to happen. He would have to keep going without knowing whether the dream would ever work. And that brings us to another side of Bill's influence. Brad grew up with the idea that a person should be capable, strong, independent, able to do things for himself. Brad later described that mindset very directly. He said he grew up with the idea of being capable, being strong and not showing weakness. And in 2019, he went even further. He said in some ways, I'm copying him. His father had grown up in hardship. He had wanted to give his children a better life. And Brad understood that the strength he had inherited from his father came from that history. But this is where the story becomes more interesting. Because Brad eventually recognized that every strength can have another side. Being capable can become a refusal to ask for help. Being strong can become a reluctance to admit weakness. And refusing to show weakness can make it harder to understand the parts of yourself that are uncertain, afraid, or simply human. Brad later reflected on exactly that. He said that the emphasis on being capable and doing things on your own had served him well, but there was something missing. Taking inventory of yourself. Recognizing the weak parts. Recognizing self-doubt. Accepting that those things are also part of being human. That is an important distinction. Because it would be unfair to turn Bill into a villain, simply because his generation had a different idea of masculinity. Brad himself did not describe his father that way. He described him as someone shaped by hardship. A man who believed strength mattered because life had taught him that it mattered. And Brad carried that lesson forward. But as he grew older, he began to understand that strength could mean something different too. Sometimes strength is not pretending you have no weakness. Sometimes it is admitting that you do. That is a lesson Brad learned later. Hollywood did not necessarily give him that lesson. Life did. But the foundation of the question came from his childhood. And that is why Bill remains part of the story, even when he is nowhere on screen. The father taught the son to be strong. The son eventually learned that strength also required honesty with himself. That is not a contradiction. It is growth. And perhaps it is one of the most human things about Brad Pitt's story. Because parents give their children a starting point. They do not give them a finished personality. The child takes those lessons into adulthood. Some are kept. Some are changed. Some are rejected. Some are finally understood decades later. Brad was about to take his father's lessons and enter a completely different world. A world where being capable would matter. A world where persistence would matter. A world where rejection would be routine. A world where their ability to keep going might be the difference between a dream and a career. But before Hollywood could test any of those qualities, Brad had to leave home. And the way he left Missouri tells us more about his relationship with his father than any Hollywood success ever could. There is a moment in almost every parent's life when a child makes a decision the parent cannot make for him. The parent can advise. The parent can warn. The parent can encourage. But eventually, the child has to choose. For Brad Pitt, that moment came when he was only weeks away from completing college. He was studying journalism at the University of Missouri. He was close to graduating. He had followed a relatively conventional path. But acting had begun to pull at him. And eventually, he decided to leave. Not after graduation. Not after securing another career. Before finishing, Brad was only 2 credits short of his degree. He had 1 paper left to write. And he walked away. Looking back now, it sounds like the beginning of a Hollywood legend. At the time, it was a gamble. Brad did not have a famous family name that could guarantee him a career. He did not have a studio contract waiting in Los Angeles. He did not know whether acting would work. He simply knew that he wanted to see what was beyond Missouri. And before leaving, he worked for a couple of weeks on the loading dock of his father's trucking company. He was earning money for gasoline. Then he got into a Datsun 200 SX that his father had bought for him. And he drove west, toward California, toward Los Angeles, toward a future that neither he nor his father could predict. There is something incredibly cinematic about that image. A young Brad Pitt, a Datsun, a few dollars, a long road west, and behind him, a father who had spent years teaching him how to work. Brad had never even been as far west as Colorado. According to his later recollection, he screamed as he crossed the Colorado state line. And then again at the next state line. And the next. Until eventually, Los Angeles was ahead of him. Hollywood was waiting. But Hollywood did not know his name. The image we have today of Brad Pitt makes it easy to forget what those first years looked like. There were no premieres, no luxury, no certainty. Brad took whatever work he could find. He drove people. He moved furniture. He did whatever he needed to do while trying to become an actor. At one point, he even wore a chicken costume to promote an El Palo Loco restaurant. It is almost impossible to connect that image with the Brad Pitt the world would eventually know. But that was the reality. Before he became a movie star, he was simply another young actor trying to survive in Los Angeles. And perhaps this is where his father's influence becomes most practical. Bill had not taught him how to become famous. He had taught him how to work, how to be capable, how to do things himself. Brad now had to use those lessons in a completely different environment. There was no guarantee. There was no clear path. There was only persistence. Small television roles came first, then bigger opportunities. And eventually, the industry began to notice him. Thelma and Louise helped make him memorable. A River Runs Through It established him as a serious young leading man. Legends of the Fall turned him into a major star. And suddenly, the young man who had driven west from Missouri was no longer unknown. The gamble had begun to pay off. But something else had changed. Brad was now entering a world completely different from his father's. Bill's career had been built in the practical world of transportation. Brad's career was built around storytelling. Bill lived largely outside the spotlight. Brad was becoming one of the most photographed people in America. Bill's work was measured by responsibility and results. Brad's work was increasingly measured by performances, reviews, box office numbers, and public attention. The two lives could not have looked more different. And yet, some of the values Brad carried into that world were familiar. Work hard. Be prepared. Do things yourself. Do not expect somebody else to solve every problem. and perhaps most importantly, see something through. Brad would later say that he had once been the kind of person who did not finish things. He was 2 credits short of graduating. He described himself as a drifter at one point. But eventually, he made a conscious decision to stop wasting his opportunities. He began finishing what he started. That transformation became part of his adult life. And it is tempting to draw a straight line from that change back to Bill. But we should be careful. Brad made that change himself. His father did not become the architect of his Hollywood career. Brad did. That is important. Because the real story of Bill Pitt is not that he secretly created one of Hollywood's biggest stars. It is much quieter. He raised a son who eventually felt confident enough to leave. He gave him a foundation. Then Brad took that foundation somewhere his father could never have predicted. And perhaps that is what successful parenting looks like. You spend years teaching a child how to stand. Then one day you watch him walk away. Not because he is rejecting you, but because you taught him how to walk on his own. Brad had now entered Hollywood. The world was beginning to see the actor. Soon it would see the movie star. But behind that public image was still the young man from Missouri. And inside that young man were lessons from a father he had never stopped carrying with him. There is a temptation to believe that Hollywood created Brad Pitt. The confidence, the discipline, the toughness, the ability to handle pressure, the willingness to take risks. But Brad himself has suggested that some of those qualities were already there before Hollywood. They came from home, from his father. Bill Pitt's influence was not simply about working hard. It was also about how a man was supposed to carry himself. Be capable, be strong, do things yourself, do not show weakness. Brad later looked back at those ideas with a much more complicated understanding. He recognized their value, but he also recognized their limitations. That is what makes the story of Bill and Brad more interesting than a simple father and son success story. Because Brad did not spend his adult life merely repeating everything his father taught him. He also learned to question some of it. And that is what growing up often means. You inherit a worldview. Then life tests it. And eventually, you decide which parts still belong to you. Brad has said that he now sees his father in the performances he gives. That is a remarkable admission. Because actors often draw from memory. They borrow from people they have known. From relationships. From childhood. From things they have observed. And for Brad, his father became part of that internal library of experience. One of the clearest examples is Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life. In the film, Brad plays a father raising 3 sons in 1950s Texas. The character is strict, demanding, sometimes difficult. He wants his sons to become strong. He wants them to be prepared for a hard world. And he carries his own frustrations into the way he raises them. The character is not Bill Pitt. Brad made that clear. He said his father could be very tough when it came to matters of integrity. But Bill was not the volatile father from the film. That distinction matters, because the value of an actor's memory is not that it allows him to simply copy someone. It gives him something to draw from. A rhythm, a voice, a way of looking at the world. A memory of what authority felt like when you were a child. Brad could understand the emotional territory of a father who wanted his sons to become strong, because he had grown up watching a father who valued strength. But he could also see the difference. And perhaps that is why his understanding of Bill became more nuanced as he grew older. The father who taught strength had also grown up in hardship. He had been determined to give his children a better life. Brad understood that. He appreciated it. But later, he began to recognize that a philosophy built around strength can sometimes make vulnerability harder to accept. Brad described that himself. He said there was value in being capable and doing things on your own. But what could be missing was taking inventory of yourself. Looking honestly at the part of you that is weak. The part that experiences self-doubt. The part that does not always know what to do. Brad eventually came to believe that you cannot fully know yourself until you can accept those parts too. That may be one of the most important things he learned after leaving Missouri. Because Bill had taught him one version of strength. Life taught him another. The first version said keep going. Stand on your own. Do not be weak. The second said know yourself. Admit when something hurts. Accept uncertainty. Understand that vulnerability does not automatically mean failure. Those two ideas do not have to cancel each other out. In fact, together they create something more mature. A person can be capable and still need help. A person can be strong and still feel afraid. A person can be independent and still need other people. Perhaps Brad needed decades to understand that. And perhaps becoming a father himself helped. Because once you have children, the memories of your own parents begin to change. You see the effort differently. You understand the sacrifices. You realize how difficult it is to balance work and family. Brad has spoken about his appreciation for what his father did. Bill worked most of the week. And then he made time for his children. Brad later understood what that required because he was living a version of that responsibility himself. That is the quiet circle of parenthood. The child watches the parent. Then the child becomes a parent. And suddenly, the things that once seemed ordinary begin to look extraordinary. The fishing trips look different. The long workdays look different. The decision to change jobs to spend more time with the family looks different. The sacrifices become visible. And perhaps that is when Brad began to understand Bill not simply as his father, but as a man. A man who had his own childhood, his own hardships, his own fears, his own ambitions. A man who had made mistakes and compromises. A man who had worked hard because he wanted his children to have more. That is a very different way of looking at a parent. When you are young, your father is simply your father. When you grow older, you begin to see the person underneath. And Brad eventually had that opportunity. He could look back at Bill's life and see a man who had tried to build something stable. Not famous, not glamorous, stable, and that stability gave Brad something valuable. The freedom to take a risk. That is an important distinction. Bill did not go to Hollywood. Brad did. Bill did not become an actor. Brad did. Bill did not become famous. Brad did. But because Brad had a home to leave, he could take the chance of leaving it. Because he had been taught to work, he could survive the years when acting did not pay. Because he had been encouraged to find something meaningful. He could pursue a career that made little practical sense at first. And because his father had shown him that work and family both mattered, Brad could eventually understand that success was not simply about how much a person could achieve. It was also about what they were willing to make time for. That may be the deepest influence Bill had on his son. Not a career, not fame, a framework, a way of looking at life. And perhaps the most remarkable thing is that Bill never needed to be famous himself. His son became famous enough for both of them. But Bill remained the man behind the story. The man who went to work. The man who took his children fishing. The man who bought his son a used-looking Datsun and watched him drive west. The man who stood up during a tennis match and asked one question. Are you having fun? And decades later, the answer to that question may still echo through Brad Pitt's career. Because Brad did not simply want to become successful. He wanted to find a life that felt meaningful. And that began with a lesson from a father who never needed the world to know his name. For more than 3 decades, the world has known Brad Pitt. We watched him arrive in Hollywood. We watched him become a leading man. We watched him become a movie star, then a producer, then one of the most established actors of his generation. We watched their awards, the films, the relationships, the headlines, the years of fame. But there was a version of Brad Pitt that existed long before any of that. A boy in Missouri, the oldest son of Bill and Jane Pitt, a young man who played tennis, a young man who went to college, a young man who was 2 credits away from graduating when he decided to leave. And behind that boy was a father, Bill Pitt. It would be easy to look at Brad's success and say that his father made him who he became. But that would be too simple. Bill did not make Brad Pitt a movie star. Brad made his own choices. He chose to leave college. He chose to drive west. He chose acting. He chose their roles. He chose their risks. He chose the career. He made mistakes. He changed. He grew. He became his own man. But every person begins somewhere. And Brad's beginning was Bill, a working father in Missouri, a man who had grown up in hardship and wanted his children to have more, a man who believed in capability, a man who believed in strength, a man who believed that you should learn to do things yourself, and a man who eventually realized that providing for a family was not enough if you missed the family itself. That last lesson may be the most powerful, because Bill could have continued chasing professional advancement. Instead, according to Brad's recollection, he changed positions so he could spend more time with his children. It was a conscious decision, a lateral move, a decision that said something very simple. Family is worth making time for. Years later, Brad would understand that differently, especially after becoming a father himself. That is the strange thing about growing older. When you are young, you think your parents are simply doing what parents do. You do not always see their exhaustion. You do not see the financial pressure. You do not see the choices they are making. You see your father go to work. You see him come home. You see him take you fishing. You think that is normal. Then you grow older. And suddenly you understand what it cost. Brad has said that becoming a parent gave him immense appreciation for the time his father carved out for his children. That appreciation may be one of the clearest signs of Bill's legacy. Not something Brad announced on a stage. Not something writ into a movie. Something he understood later. Something that became clearer with age. And perhaps that is the kind of legacy most parents actually leave. Not fame, not money, not a monument. Memories, values, habits, ways of thinking. Small moments that remain long after childhood is gone. For Brad, one of those moments was a tennis court. His father walking toward him. One question: are you having fun? Another was a weekend spent fishing. Another was the memory of a father who worked hard and still found time for his children. Another was the moment Brad stood 2 credits short of graduation and decided to leave. And before he drove west, he worked on the loading dock of his father's trucking company to earn enough money for gasoline. Then Bill's son got into the Datsun and drove toward California. That may be the perfect image for this entire story. A father working, a son leaving, and the space between them filled with everything the father had taught the son. Bill could not tell Brad what Hollywood would become. He could not know whether his son would succeed. He could not know that Brad would become one of the most famous actors of his generation. He could not know that one day millions of people would know his son's face. All he could do was raise him, and then let him go. Brad did not simply follow his father's path. He created a completely different one. Bill lived largely outside the spotlight. Brad became one of the most photographed people on Earth. Bill worked in transportation. Brad built a career in film. Bill's world was Missouri. Brad's world became international. But underneath those differences, some things remained. Their importance of work, their importance of family, their importance of responsibility. And eventually, though understanding that strength is not the same thing as pretending you never struggle. That final lesson may be where Brad's story moves beyond his father's generation. Bill taught him to be capable. Brad eventually learned that being capable also means knowing yourself. Bill taught him strength. Brad eventually learned that real strength can include vulnerability. Bill taught him to stand on his own. Life taught Brad that standing on your own does not mean standing alone. That is not a rejection of his father. It is what happens when a son takes the lessons he was given and carries them into a world his father never experienced. And perhaps that is the greatest compliment a child can give a parent. Not to become exactly like them, but to take what was good, understand what was difficult, and build something new. Bill Pitt never needed to become famous. He never needed to appear on magazine covers. He never needed Hollywood to know his name. He was already important to the person who mattered most. His son. There were rare moments when the public did get to see Bill beside Brad. He appeared with his family at the 2012 Academy Awards. He later joined Brad at the Unbroken premiere in 2014. Those moments were unusual because Bill and Jane largely stayed outside the spotlight. And perhaps that is fitting, because Bill's story was never really about being seen. It was about being there before anyone was looking. Before Brad Pitt had a career. Before the fame. Before the fortune. Before the cameras. Before the world decided who Brad Pitt was supposed to be. There was a father in Missouri raising a boy. Teaching him to work. Teaching him to stand on his own. Taking him fishing. Watching him play tennis. And eventually, watching him drive away toward a future nobody could guarantee. The world remembers the movie star. But the movie star had a beginning. And that beginning was not Hollywood. It was home. It was family. It was Missouri. And it was a father named Bill. Perhaps that is why the story of William Alvin Pitt deserves to be remembered. Not because he was the man who created Brad Pitt, but because he was the man who knew Brad Pitt before the world did. Before the photographs, before the awards, before the premieres, before the millions of people who would eventually recognize his face. Bill knew him simply as his son. And sometimes, behind the most famous names in the world, there is a quieter name that came first. A name the cameras never needed to know. A father who was there before the fame, before the fortune, before Hollywood. Before Brad Pitt became Brad Pitt, he was simply Bill Pitt's son.